Hi, and welcome to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. Thank you for checking out our podcast. Established in 1935, we're an American-owned and family-owned independent seed company. And we're excited to partner with you by bringing you 5 generations of agricultural experience and decades of industry expertise. In our podcasts, you can expect to gain valuable and timely information to aid you in making decisions for your operation. We'll keep things simple and informative, and much like our motto, planet, profit. Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed Podcast. This is Juan, Cornelius Seed Innovation Lead, and I'm joined by Craig Alleman, our lead agronomist. In this episode, we're going to cover a wide variety of topics that tie into the season we're heading into, or some of us have already started, and that's harvest. We're going to talk about how to assess stock quality in corn, managing test weight issues and dry conditions, addressing nitrate concerns and drought-stressed corn silage, and so much more. So without further ado, welcome, Craig.
Hey, thank you, Juan.
How are you doing? But I guess before we get into our ag talk, I know you've just married off another one, and pretty recent back from a trip out on the West Coast. Was it Montana?
Wyoming.
Wyoming. Oh, better, even better. You've got one left in the nest, right?
Yeah, but that's the tough one. That's the daughter.
Oh boy, that's for me. As far as I'm concerned, with my 2 girls and the third I have coming, they're never leaving that nest.
Well, people always kind of joke around and say that boys are a lot easier to raise than girls are. But what I have found out, through our whole experiences, they're absolutely correct.
Oh, that's funny. Well, let's as you drove across the Midwest, and even some of the West Coast, and now back home, and now here recently, how are things looking?
Well, I've told people at the plot tours I've been doing the last couple of weeks, we've had a bunch, and so I've traveled, pretty much our foot, the state of Iowa and southwest Wisconsin. So I've got a pretty good picture, and of course that when you think about that geography, that's really the heart of the Corn Belt. That's some big productive areas, and I've talked in front of people at plot tours and about what I'm seeing and what I think the crop condition out there, and I finally get to the point where I tell them I'm starting to depress myself, and I feel like the Grim Reaper. But I think most years we talk about look, we got a pretty solid crop, but there's going to be some surprises out there, and there's going to be some variability. I really think this year's kind of we've kind of flipped that over, and there's just a lot of tough acres out there, and the prizes are going to be more of those fields that are really, really strong on yield. There's not going to be a lot of those. There is some pockets depending on when you got the rain and how much you got during the growing season, but the overall theme, or the overall what I continue to see is we had that early drought stress that was tough enough, and it does look like that came in late enough. We questioned it at the time, but it does look like our rows around in most areas are pretty good. We've got 16 to 20 rows around in a lot of places. There are exceptions to that, where that was reduced, but that was pretty good. But that early summer drought, that lasted, May and most of June, it did in most of the area that I have traveled shorten the ears up significantly. So that's the time frame when that plant is determining how many kernels per row they're having, and that was definitely shortened up in a lot of cases. And then there's a significant amount of tip back that would be a combination of kernels that were aborted, and the aborted kernels, they'll be the little shriveled up next to the kernels that went ahead and fertilized and then we kept. So they'll be yellow and shriveled up, so you can tell the ones that did get pollinated but then aborted, and then just the tip there where it never did get pollinated. So ears are shorter, significant tip back in a lot of places, but the real killer, I think, is going to be the depth of our kernels, which is very satisfactory. And we compared last year, which was maybe one of the better years ever in corn yields in this area, and it's going to be starkly different than it was last year. And then just the weight per kernel. So we'll talk about test weight here in a little bit, and I always try to probably get up on my soapbox in that a little bit, but the weight per kernel, because you get paid per weight, you don't get paid by volume of bushels, you get paid weight. So that lack of depth, and then just the lack of weight that probably went in here at the end, that week of upper 90 and lower 100-degree weather was just a killer for us. I mean, it really, when we should have been putting that really top end yield into the kernels, it was pretty much shutting them down. So, it's kind of three things going on there that I think the yields are not even close to what some of the yield tours, I guess, that have been through are showing. I could be pleasantly surprised on that, but I'm going to err on the side of saying that it's a pretty tough crop in a lot of areas. Doesn't mean we're not going to have still decent bushels, but instead of 200 to 250, it might be 150 to 200. So
recent estimate came out from USDA, and that one was, I think I saw the average for the area was 175 and 177, maybe in the 170s, and I'd follow it on now X, formerly Twitter, and there's several folks that have sentiments that that it should be either up, there should be down bushels. No one said it should be more than that. I guess no one ever does, but you've talked about the micro environments before, where folks even relatively close to each other will have the best year, and then others not.
Right.
There was a recent plot tour up northern Iowa that Janie was talking about that those folks were 10 inches of rain behind where they would be at this point of the year, which I think a lot of folks, August has been that way, and but that the crop looked great, and so obviously there's a bunch of other factors that tie into that, but in a good looking crop for those that look good. And I was talking to Tyler earlier. He said he's received some questions about just certain genetics suppliers, trait suppliers seem to have like what looks to be a greener looking plant at this point of the year. Do you think that's something that's there, or it's just the area that they're in, or maybe they put some pivot bio on it and the nitrogen is staying on, it's doing better later in the year. But I guess before we get to assessing the right time to harvest, I kind of wanted to see if you had any thoughts around that.
Well, every hybrid is different on its stay green in a normal year, and it doesn't really vary by genetic supplier. Genetic supplier A is going to have products with good stay green, and it's going to have products with average stay green. So I wouldn't draw too much of a conclusion with that. I guess if you got one company that's everything staying green, that would question their genetic diversity more than anything, if everything's closely related and got stay green. But
that's a good point.
As far as yield goes, at the end of the year, the ones that hold their stay green over the ones that don't, as far as grain yield goes, I wouldn't pull any correlation to that at all, because some of the hybrids that we call die and dry are your highest yielding hybrids out there. They finish and put everything into the year and start drying down and maturing very rapidly at the end. So I wouldn't draw any conclusions there.
Okay, good. Thank you. We kind of talked about this before we got going, and I forgot he and I connected just a little bit before that, and that's something he wanted to throw your way. So I appreciate that. Well, I mentioned in the intro just the variety of topics we have, and this one's so varied, and some of the I guess questions that were coming in from the country and their district sales managers have been getting. So we're going to jump into a concern that a lot of folks are talking about. What does poor stock quality really translate to, and how can it be assessed?
Well, we'll talk about stock quality in general from what I've seen, and I guess first thing I would say is this: the good old fashioned stock, diseases, stock rots that we look at. We're really fairly clean out there. In general, we had a pretty healthy corn crop, and by that I mean we didn't have a lot of fungal diseases, a lot of foliar fungal diseases like the gray leaves. I've seen tar here late. The tar that's coming in this late doesn't will not mean jack squat to hurting our yield and finishing out. It came in way too late, and there really weren't any other diseases that were present when it did come in. So we were pretty healthy, and when you're healthy like that, the plant's able to fight off those normal stock ruts like anthracnose and other things. So in general, on my travels, I haven't seen a lot. Now, the one I have seen a lot, which does not surprise us from back to spring and emergence conditions, is there's probably more crown rot than I've seen in a long time. And so this time of the year, if you do still have any green in your corn out there, if you see individual plants or, maybe a couple in a row, but very scattered that are just completely dead, they've died, everything else is still green out there. If you'll dig that up and split that stalk clear down into the ground, where the crown is, so the triangle part down in there, you're likely to see that that's going to be a dark brown and decayed, and that's your crown rot. Now, crown rot 99% of the time was caused by fusarium that actually set in right after, right at germination. It's at the seedling stage. And so, we'll have fusarium to some extent every year. The early planted stuff, it got colder than expected. So we had some fusarium sit in those cases because it likes cool, wet. You've got your three big soil-borne fungal diseases that we really worry about: Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and Pythium. All three of those, the spores that cause those, that infect the plant, can swim in water. Okay. Now, north central Iowa, we had that 3 to 9 inches, whatever it was, rain right after planting there in early May. And I walked some fields that we probably had a 10% stand loss, from that fusarium. So we pretty much knew that this fall we were going to see some crown rot in those areas, and we definitely have. So that'll affect standability, in and of itself. But this year, what we're really worried about with standability is just the drought here late, the grain fill drought. Of course, we had the early drought, and that hurt us there. But there's a lot of areas that did not receive a lot of rain in August, or really from mid-July through today. I've been in some areas that received an inch of rain over the past couple of days in that time period. So when that happens, the roots are not going to be able to take up moisture and nutrients. So the corn plant always remobilizes some nutrients to fill the year. That's just kind of a normal function of the plant. And it may bring those out of the leaves, or it may bring them out of the stalk, and particularly the lower stalk. But when we get droughty conditions, particularly potash, potassium, is remobilized out of that lower stalk and will feed the ear to finish it out. So that lower stalk becomes very, very questionable in droughty situations. Now, after having said that, and that is the case. I mean, as I'm out there looking and doing push tests and things, there's not a lot left in that lower stalk. But the pith itself, last several years, I've had years where I thought we've got stalk issues out here, and in the not the pith but the rind. So just the outside of the stalk can be pretty tough. I think particularly on these modern hybrids. So doesn't mean just because we robbed the lower stalk that we're going to have issues if we get a windstorm. But we do not want to let this crop sit out there and take that chance this year. Was in 104-day corn just west of Cedar Rapids on the way down, and talked to the customer, and he said they had hand shelled it at 20%, and they were planning on starting tomorrow. Wow. So I did hand shell some of mine after that, and talking to Corey Link over there at Abbey. said, they've got some corn down in that low 20s that they're going to get after here, planted like that 10th of April. I did hand shell some 13th of April planting, 113 day there west of Monmouth, and came up with 28.2 on that for moisture. But there's probably corn out here that's ready to go, and we do not want to leave it sitting out there because our stocks, we should not expect our stocks to hold up this fall at all.
Reminds me that, for every season, we're trying to have a campaign to focus on things that tie back to your profit. And, obviously in this particular case, we're talking, what's a harvest priority? What should we be getting after first? A storm could come by, or the dryer gets, you can leave kernels out in the acres, and that's not good. Our current campaign's the pause, push, and pinch. Can you tell us a little bit about how that ties into what you're talking about?
Yeah. So pause is always just like pause when we're planning. I mean, you need to. Everybody's busy, and I know you're busy. Getting your harvest equipment ready and everything else. But you need to spend a little time out in your field. You need to get into each field individually, and see what you've got out there. So that's your pause from what you're doing, and then so push tests are real easy. You just walk down the row and you just push on the plant at the ear level, so shoulder high there usually, and you just push it the length of your arm. And if that stalk has an issue, that plant will usually give, that stalk will give and it won't come back up. And if it doesn't have an issue, you push that stalk out and it'll bounce right back into the row in place there. A lot of times I'll do, when I go out there, if that ear is tipped down, unless it's got a real long shank on it, like Company X out there usually does, those ears will be upright normally if that stalk's in pretty good shape, and they will have tipped, if that stalk's got some issues down there. So, that's the push test. You can also pinch down there at that bottom foot on the stalk and see if there's, if it's hollowed out, if it has issues, and that's another indication. So that's what we talk about for that time of the year. Get out there and take some time to see if you've got some stalk issues, and then get those up on the list of harvest and get after them before we get a storm, and we'll wish we had.
Well, definitely. And like you said, you're out there assessing that and figuring out what your harvest plan, right? You should always be planning. It isn't just during the planting season, but also getting out of there and coming up with that game plan. There was some folks up in their area where, oh gosh, what I'd call that northeast Iowa. Well, I guess out by Decorah neck of the woods, and they had some corn with 20% moisture, but it hadn't yet black layered, and that obviously raised some eyebrows and brought some concern. How do you handle that? I mean, how do you with harvesting it and then just drying and storage considerations? What are some things to consider?
Well, we think of corn not reaching black layer, in years that we have an early frost, maybe late planted corn, especially in the northern regions. But corn can also, get shut down, die basically before it reaches black layer or physiological maturity. Now, there are researchers that will argue that it always does black layer no matter what. So there's still a couple of camps on that side. But regardless, even if it shuts down before it reaches the normal black layer, so you got that incision layer at the tip of the kernel, you split that open, there'll be a black line there when it's done feeding that kernel. But it'll still dry down, by the normal process, and that's, a factor of temperature and humidity out there in the field. So even if you haven't reached that, it's going to continue to dry down. Clearly, that corn has, if it's down to 20% moisture. But you may have issues with test weight if that didn't reach black layer before the plant. You're not gonna have the normal heavy weight in those kernels. So that could be an issue, and you got to make sure you don't have storage issue. You haven't started, probably to get some kernel rots or something like that. So just make sure that might be the field that might need to go to town, so you just don't have to worry about those issues.
Yeah, test weight was another thing that was brought up, but we may have already covered it. It's obviously greatly attributed to the dry season, but one more.
That's a good segue into it, and it's going to, that any customer that I've talked to or applied to, that's always a question on everybody's mind. So I'm going to get a little bit up on my soapbox here and talk about test weight in general, because test weight, you got to remember, test weight and kernel weight are two different things. Okay. So test weight is going to be a measurement of the volume that we can fit into a container, whether that's a bushel, whether that's a semi truck, or whether it's a bin. And test weight does not equal yield. Okay. Just because we have a high test weight doesn't mean that's the hybrid that's going to win the plot or whatever. So a lot of times, those hybrids that have a heavy test weight, they may have a more vitreous kernel, less starch in there, so possibly the kernel that is there is a little heavier, but a lot of times they'll be slicker, they'll be smaller kernels, and you can pack more of those into a bushel. So it's no different. I always use the example of, if you have a bushel basket full of pea gravel versus 3-inch gravel, what's going to weigh the most? Well, the pea gravel will, because there's not going to be much airspace in there, much pore space. So it's the same with the test weight. Now, the only thing we worry about with test weight really is whether we're going to get docked at the elevator. Okay. And I mentioned that 20% 104-day hybrid, that plant has been shut down for a while. The kernels the depth on them is not impressive, but the kernels themselves are pretty, they have really good grain quality to them. And the customer had mentioned that it was a 20% test weight not a 20%, but a 56-pound test weight at 20%. So when you factor that up, that's going to add another point or so, so that test weight is not bad, even though that plant likely shut down a little earlier than we would like to have seen it, and the kernels are pretty shallow. Okay, so on the reverse side, these kernels that I took in on this field down here that were 28% moisture, I think they were like a 54-pound test weight. Now they'll increase up, once they're dried down and everything, but their kernels were huge, and very good grain quality on them, and very good weight, on that ear. But just large kernels at this stage of the game is not going to give you a great test weight. So you're getting paid on weight that comes off of that field. So you got so many kernels, and it's all about how much weight per kernel that you're going to have, and that can vary based on the hybrid. But in these droughty areas, when I pull these ears and I'm kind of trying to do a yield estimate, the ears are pretty light compared to what we would see on a really good year. Okay. It's not hard if you've done enough of it to see that out there.
Oh, well, that's good. Thanks for covering that, Craig. Moving on from that, there was a question that regarded nitrate concerns, and that was, with specifically drought stress silage from the drought. What are some watch outs that the producer should be concerned with, and what are your thoughts on that as a whole?
Well, we always worry in a drought year about having too much nitrates, and nitrates will accumulate in that corn plant, and especially in the lower part of the stalk. So when we're chopping silage, the first thing that we've come out of droughty conditions is we raise up that head on the silage chopper, and we try to, if we normally leave maybe 10 inches or whatever of that stalk, we might double that, just so we're leaving that part where the nitrates tend to accumulate. And then it's always advisable, once you've got that silage in the bunker or the bag or wherever you're storing it, let it go through its ensiling period, and then send a sample off to a lab and make sure your nitrate levels aren't overly high. You're going to be feeding it to. So that's always a good precaution to take. The other thing I guess I'd mention a little bit is, drive around here, or made such a big circle here over the last couple of weeks, boy, you can just see the holes, what I would call holes out there in fields. And what I mean by that is just soybean fields are really easy to see. And of course, you go across the rolling acres of Iowa, it's really able to see, you're able to see over the tops. There's just a lot of, yellow area, dead soybean fields. We see that a lot in kind of that north central towards the west in Iowa, where we have a lot of iron deficiency chlorosis in soybeans, and a lot of times those patches will die before the mature. But heck, I'm seeing all over in Iowa, as you jump across the river on highway into Illinois, just way more pronounced than normal. And there's those areas out there in the corn, we're seeing the same thing. And I go back to that early summer drought, we saw such extreme cases of potash deficiencies, and that was just visible, but just what the drought did to those plants. If you're setting in dry soil, you're just not taking in not only the water, but the nutrients that you normally would. And potash being a positive ion, it binds pretty tight to organic matter, and clay. And, so not only those roots have to get to it, but it has to get into the soil solution to be able to take it up. And so potash deficiency was really, just really pronounced this year in the early part with the early drought. And then we kind of alleviated it a little bit when we got some moisture there, late June, early July, but we've revisited that. So those areas, I think, that were damaged in the early summer drought, now we're seeing them, and they're those holes that I talk about seeing out in the fields. And so, how will that average out to the crop? It can't be good. And here I am, the Grim Reaper again, but we've got some issues out there.
Well, I think it's just important to know what they are, in case there's something that we can manage next year differently. Obviously, with Mother Nature, the best you can do on that is gamble on when you're going to plant your planting date and see if that works for you. But if there's anything that's within the control that can make us better for next year, that's obviously good. You brought up soybeans, and some of our people were wondering, how can we distinguish whether the bean is drought stressed or if it's the SDS or sudden death syndrome? What to look for?
And we've had a ton of SDS in the South. I mean, I've seen SDS all the way up to Minnesota this year, and we've had a fair amount of white mold in pockets. More in the north, but down here, in central Illinois, I've seen some too. But whole fields of sudden death down here, probably the worst I've seen sudden death in the wild. And remember, sudden death is going to set into the plant right after germination. So that early seedling disease, again, it's going to be in the roots and the stem all year. We don't always see it in the leaves. You have to have a pretty decent rain event in that, early, maybe first half of August. And then that causes the disease to shoot those toxins up to the leaves. And that's when we see that it's out there. But we could be having sudden death every year and just not see the leaf portion of it. But it's pretty easy to identify. So when these fields started turning earlier, some of them, there was getting to be funky colors out there that I didn't expect to be there at that time of the year. So I always go out and try to identify what the disease is. But with sudden death, you'll have interveinal chlorosis. So the veins will still be green, but in between the veins, first it turns yellow and, eventually brown, and the tissue completely dies. But that could also be brown stem rot. It could be caused by the newer disease, the red stem rot that we've had in Illinois last couple of years. So, but if you see that interveinal chlorosis, most times it's sudden death. You would pull that plant and split the stem. If the white inner part of that stem, the pith, is brown in a lot of places up through there, and sometimes brown and pulled apart, That's going to be stem rot. And if it's not, it's probably going to be sudden death in most cases. And the stem right down there by the ground, the root itself and the first inch or two, that vascular tissue on the outside of the pith, that's usually discolored and, a darker color. So it's fairly easy to determine that. And then the drought conditions, they're not going to have that same type of appearance.
So, I mean, it sounds like you got some tiger stripes on the plant, and it's probably sudden death. So, with if I'm hearing you correct, you're saying that'll just be uniform, and you won't have the veins looking healthier. So, if it's uniform across the bean, it's
That's right. It's uniform yellowing, and then kind of premature yellowing, and then death. I mean, these really severe droughty pockets that we're seeing out here, and maybe that was clay soils or a rocky area or something, but yeah, they just completely ran out of water, and those plants have died there.
okay. So more often than not now, at least in a lot of areas, folks are seeing, especially with beans getting planted early, to protect against pythium and things like that. Folks are treating their beans, and we use the Saltro camp. Believe in it, but are we seeing? Is that showing protection in those fields that you, at least for customers of ours that we're aware of that you know of, or is it would you call it an outbreak of SDS, and is our treatments getting overpowered?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing good results from the Saltro. I'm seeing less of the SDS where we had Saltro treated beans, but it's not going to be perfect. I mean, it's not a 100%. We'll completely stop it. It's going to greatly reduce it. Point where it's going to be a bad outbreak. It's probably going to be a 2 to 5 bushel type yield increase. By using the Saltro. Elevo, of course, is the other product. We choose the Saltro because we really don't like the phototoxic effect on the cotyledons and how it could interact with some of the soil applied chemistries out there. But yeah, either one of those products does a great job of controlling enough SDS to give us a pretty good yield bump.
Well, good. That's promising, and that's years like this, it sounds like it pays off, and it pays for itself. What are some takeaways or some things that we need to really keep at top of mind, as folks are making their harvest plan, or maybe they already started, but it's just good to hear again?
Yeah, I don't know. That we missed anything. I will say, and I've been preaching this to our customers, dealers, DSMs. Early summer droughts are a really, really weird deal, and they'll affect hybrids very differently. If a hybrid is a real early flowering type product, or it's packing more of those yield decisions into a smaller window, sometimes those hybrids can really get hammered by an early drought. But those are pretty rare. So you're going to have hybrids that you're not very happy with their performance versus another hybrid you've got in the field or in a different field. I would encourage people to, take that with a grain of salt, not a good hybrid that might be your best products here. So there's going to be some great variability. A hybrid's ability to handle stress when it's determining length of the row, or handle stress during pollination, not aborting and things like that, and then putting kernel depth into it. There's going to be some big differences. I think you want to, as you're evaluating that, you want to keep that in mind, that there's some pretty heavy pressures out there, and there's going to be some good hybrids that might be nipped, but we plant a package of hybrids just for this reason, because we're going to have stress at different times of the year, and you don't want all hybrids that can handle a grain fill stress, but not an early season stress, versa, So
Well, that ties into kind of the comment that you made as it relates to that staying green on that corn, right? As if there's one particular provider that's you're seeing that with, and it may concern if not there's not enough diversity in there.
Yeah, I've said this before, so it may sound a little bit odd, but when we have a hybrid that's in our portfolio that has a bad year, that really means that your plan, spreading your risk out, has worked. It doesn't mean that, oh, that's a crap hybrid. It means that I know I'm going to have different conditions this year, and there's a hybrid in my portfolio that's not going to like it. But the only thing you can do there is try to guess what the weather's going to be and plant all hybrids that are going to react the same way, and that's not a good way to go forward.
I've heard you say before about you talk about the sins of the past haunting you in the future, and we're getting to a point where we might be able to see some of those now. What's
Now,
this?
to be clear, I wasn't talking about my personal sins there, right?
Oh boy, I lost it. Okay, then I missed.
Yeah. Agronomic type thing.
Agronomic, yes. Not that you're not a Bronco fan. That's the
Okay.
thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's, I don't think there's any a blame for the weather that we've had this year. I don't think that. I mean, if I related to your question there, some of the things that hurt this year, cover crops were tough because we 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 dried that ground out so much, and then we had that early summer drought right on top of it. Some of the emergence and some of the moisture in those cover crops areas were really tough. Does that make a bad practice, or
No.
was it the do? Probably not. It has its merits, and where it's useful, it's very useful. And I think guys will continue to do it. In certain, but so I'm not pulling much of anything this year. I mean, I don't think there were a lot of mistakes made. We just got what we got.
Okay.
So I wouldn't change a lot for next year. If you have to set out a few days of harvest because you got rained out, that's going to be a really, really good thing, because our number one thing now for next year, for setting up next year, is to get some moisture back into this ground, because there cannot be very much.
No.
So we've got to get that subsoil moisture built back up between now and planting season.
Well, no, thank you for all that, Craig. Anything else that we need you want to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think we've probably sufficiently depressed everybody.
Well, thank you all for joining. And if you have any comments or questions or concerns, or you'd like for us to cover anything, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook or X or Instagram, and get on our website and give us a buzz, and we'd be happy to help you out. So until the next one, have a happy